Hi, it's Beefy and welcome to my channel. I had a few questions about one of my recent Instagram and YouTube posts. It was about my effective flags. Basically, I was asked, how did I do that? The short answer is X particles, but really the answer goes a lot deeper than that. I've been playing around with surface affection for a little while now, and I had the idea of affecting images, these flags. And to create these, I drew upon some great techniques I've learned along the way while learning X particles, and I'd like to share these with you. I'm going to show you the basics of setting up a simple shockwave in X particles and ExplosiaFX, and how you can art direct them to make amazing variations in your shockwaves. Then I'm going to show you how you can use your shockwave to affect surface particles. And finally, I'm going to show you how to prepare your particles for rendering, applying the geometry and your image texture and all that good stuff. So without further ado, let's jump in and do this. Okay, so I jumped into Cinema 4D here and I've got a simple scene set up. I have 150 frames on my timeline and I have a camera that's at world 0 and that's looking down at my flag reference. And my flag reference is a simple plane with a material applied to it. So it's a standard Cinema 4D material. I just have the color channel activated, and in the texture I have a Canadian flag piped in, and the Canadian flag is a 2:1 ratio. So I've made my plane 400 by 200, which is a 2:1 ratio, and this will ensure that there's no distortion on my image. So on my camera I have a protection tag. I don't need to see this for the rest of the tutorial, so I'm going to hold Alt and I'm going to double click these traffic lights here, and that's hidden from my viewport, and it's still active so I can come into it whenever I want. Flag reference, I'm just going to switch off completely. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to bring in an X particle system, and I've updated to the latest version of X particles, so I'm now in Insydium Fused. So I need to come to the Insydium drop down here and come to X particles, and I'm going to bring in an XP system, and by default it comes with everything that you need, and it comes with an emitter, a standard emitter that's emitting on the Z plus axis. Now I want to make some changes to this emitter. I want my emitter to be emitting particles in the XZ plane from the center here. So I'm going to come in, and first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to change the name of the emitter. I'm going to call it Shockwave. Excuse my fat fingers here. And this is because we're going to be building our Shockwave now. So we're coming to the object tab, and I want to change the emitter shape to circle, and I want to make the disk radius about 15, and I want the emitter to be on the Y plus plane, and I want to emit from the ring only. Now when I play, we have our particles shooting straight into the air on the Y plus. This isn't what we want. We want our particles to be emitting from the ring outwards on the XZ. So to do that, if I just play this, we have the cone angle, and the cone angle, you can change the direction of the particles. So you can go negative and you can go positive, and if you go positive 90 degrees, we now have our particles emitting from the center. Lovely. So far so good. So I don't want my particles to be emitting at a rate, so I'm going to come into the emission tab here, and I'm going to change the emission type to shot, and I want this to start on, say, 10 frames. So I've got a few frames beforehand before the advection happens, and I want to change the shot count to, say, I don't know, like 200 for the moment. See how we go with that. I'm not touching the lifespan of the particles, but I'm going to change the speed to 80, and I'm going to increase the radius to, say, 10, because I want some nice big plumes in our Shockwave. Now I'm going to come to the display tab, and I'm going to change the particle type, the display, from squares to circle, just so we can see what's going on. And if I press play, we now got the beginning of our Shockwave. So the next thing I want to do is I want to bring in a dynamic object. So I want to come to the Dynamics tab, and I want to bring in ExplosiaFX. And by default, it brings in this huge solver. We're not going to use this whole solver. If I could bring in the flag reference so you can see what's going on. I'm emitting from the center across the XZ plane. We're not going to be using all this space on the top and the bottom here. So I'm going to change the solver size. So I'm going to come to the ExplosiaFX solver. So I'm going to change the Y. I'm going to change the Y to 80 centimeters. And I'm going to change the X to 420. And I'm going to change the Z to 220. I'm going to keep my voxel size to 4 centimeters. This is my personal preference. If you're experiencing like any lag in your viewport, then just increase your voxel size to, I don't know, maybe like try 6 or 7. We're not actually going to be rendering the Shockwave. We're just going to be advecting some particles, but I like to have that little bit extra level of detail because I like to work with smaller particles. And in my previous examples that I showed you, I have 1 million particles in there. So like with an increased voxel size, it's going to be a bit blocky. So I like to keep this kind of roundabout here. Is a good number for me. So, but just experiment with that because you don't want any lag in your viewport. So just bring that number up if you do experience any lag. Okay. So I'm going to hide the flag reference again now, and I'm just going to press play. And nothing is happening. So what I need to do, there's a couple of things I need to do. What we need to do is we need to tell ExplosiaFX that the Shockwave is the source for the ExplosiaFX. So I'm just going to right click on the Shockwave here, and I'm going to come down to the Insydium tags, and I'm going to come to ExplosiaFX source. And the other thing I need to do is I need to come into the extended data, and if we come to the physical data, we can see that we have no fuel, and with no fuel there'll be no Shockwave. So I'm going to say I'm going to add 3 fuel, see how we go with that. And now if I play, we now have our Shockwave going on. So I'm going to come into the top view so we can see exactly what's going on. And apart from looking like the eye of Sauron, this is looking quite good so far. But I don't want this Shockwave to be lagging behind. I want this to keep up with the particles. So to do that, I'm going to come to the ExplosiaFX source tag, and I'm going to increase the velocity to, say, 400. That's a good number. And so now if I play, we can now see that the Shockwave is now keeping up with the particles, and this is exactly what we want. We've got a slight lag behind, but that's all good. So the next thing I want to do, I want to bring some more detail to this Shockwave, and it's kind of looking chunky there. So I'm going to come to the ExplosiaFX, and I'm going to come into the display, and this is a great tip from Bob Walmsley and the guys at Insydium, is that by default the display is in slices, and to get more level of detail there, you're going to have to change the amount of slices, and you're going to have to change the amount of resolution. So that means the simulation will be running slower in your viewport, and we don't want that. So the tip is, if you come to the mode here and you just click here, and instead of slices we want to choose grid, and immediately we have these voxels appear in our display port. Now the great thing about this is that we can now increase our level of detail. So I'm going to increase this to say like 150. You can go a lot higher if you want to, but I think we get enough definition here. And when we play this, this is looking really great now. The next thing I want to bring your attention to is this adaptive bounds box. The blue box that seems to be ever present when you run an ExplosiaFX simulation. And this adaptive bounds box is here for a reason. We just come into the default view so we can see what's going on. So this encompasses the whole of the Shockwave here. And if I come in here, so what's actually happening is all the calculation is actually happening in this box. And the reason why the box is here by default is so that your system doesn't slow down. So instead of calculating the whole area, is calculating the area where the explosion is going to be. And we don't want that to be actually happening. We want the simulation to be calculating the particles right from the beginning. So we want this whole area, but also the adaptive bounds is cutting off the plumes here. So if we come to the ExplosiaFX and we come to the solver and we just scroll down, we have this adaptive bounds. If we just switch that off and we now play, we still have these lovely plumes going on here, and it's still running just as fast. Okay, so we have these lovely plumes now on either side and nothing's been cut off, and this is looking great so far. This is looking quite uniform. So what I want to do is I want to put some variation in the speed of the particles and some variation in the size. So if we come to the emitter here, what I want to do is I want to come to the emission here, and I want to put some variation in speed. So I want some particles to be lagging behind here, and I want faster particles to be moving. So what I want to do is put some variation in our speed. So we're 80 centimeters at the moment. I want to change this to 75. So that means that the slower particles will be traveling at 5 centimeters and the faster particles will be traveling at 155 centimeters. So we're going to get some good variation between 5 centimeters and 155. Now the radius of the particle, I want to put some variation on this as well. So I want to say 4. So now we're going to get particles that are between 6 centimeters and 14 centimeters. So we're going to get some different size plumes, which is going to give even more variation to our Shockwave. So now if I play this, so now I'm going to, that's looking good. I'm getting a little bit of overlapping going on here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce the shot count to maybe to, let's say 120, see how it's doing over that. And that's looking good. So we've got some nice variation here, nice shapes happening, and it's looking very organic. This is exactly what we want. If I come into the default view, we can see exactly what's happening here. So now we've got these lovely plumes happening here, and it's looking pretty good. I think it's going to be a lovely simulation for our Advection here. So just play around with these figures. You don't have to do the same as me. You can have a different speed for your particles, have a different variation, even change the size of your radius. You can even change the lifespan of your particles. You can have them dying off after a few frames, and that will give you another look for your advection. And another emission type that you can actually play around with will be actually pulse. So you can have your Shockwave pulsing every, I don't know, like every 60 frames, and you can have your particles dying off before the next pulse. So that's going to give you another look. So just play around with this. So I'm just going to keep this Shockwave as it is. Just keep it simple. Another area that you can look at to get some more variation into your Shockwave is to come to the simulation tab, and you can just play with these figures here. Now I tend not to muck around with these top parameters here and that, but I do play with the vorticity, and I've played with the turbulence strength and the turbulence radius as well. So just by nudging this a little bit either way and stuff, and that is going to give you another look altogether. But for this instance, I'm going to change the vorticity to say around 30, because I do like the effect that this gives. So vorticity is the eddies that the plumes will create, and the higher the number, the tighter these eddies are going to be. You're not going to see anything much now, so you're only going to see that when you start advecting some particles. So we're pretty much done creating our Shockwave here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off our Shockwave, and I'm going to turn off our ExplosiaFX. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come into the emitters, and I'm going to create another emitter. Now I'm going to change the name of this emitter to Advected. These are the particles that's going to be advected by our Shockwave. Now I don't want to be using this standard emitter here. I want to be using my flag reference, which is my plane, and I want to be emitting from the plane, and I want to drive the color of the particles with the material. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come into the object tab, and I'm going to change the emitter shape to object, and I'm going to drop the flag reference into the object field. Now I don't want to be emitting from the polygon center. I want to be emitting from the material. I'm going to click here, and I'm going to scroll down this drop down menu. I'm going to come to texture. Now that we selected texture, we get this new texture tab. So we click on here. It's now asking for a texture tag, and we've already got one of these, which is indicating that material has been applied to our flag reference here. So I'm just going to drag this tag here, and I'm going to drop it into the field. Now that we dropped our material tag into this field here, we've unlocked these parameters here. So I'm going to lock this for the moment, and I'm going to bring in my Cinema 4D material. Let me just bring this over here. On the left, we have the channels for the emission. So you can drive the emission with your material tag and your color, your radius, your speed, offset, and scale. On the right here, in these fields, is referring to the channels in your material. So if you click this, and this will reveal a drop down here. So you've got your color, diffusion, luminance, transparency, bump, alpha, displacement. So these here are referring to your channels here in your material. We've already got our color selected, so we need to have color selected. So I'm just going to leave these as they are. But if you have your material piped into your luminance, then just use the drop down menu here and add the luminance instead of the color. I hope that makes sense. So I'm going to close this now. So at the moment, the emit channel is saying that the color is going to drive the emission, and I don't want that. So I'm just going to say none. I want my particles to be emitted evenly across this plane. but I do want the color of the particles to be driven by the material. So I'm going to leave that on color. Just going to unlock this now. I'm going to go straight to the display, and I'm going to change the particle display to, I'm going to change the particle display from squares to arrows. And now when I play, we now have our colors on our particles. So where they're being emitted from the red, they're red. When they're being emitted from the white, they're white. This is exactly what we want. But I want these to be stuck to the surface. So I'm going to come back to the object tab here, and I'm going to come to the emitter tab. And here where it says stick particle to source object, I'm just going to check that. So now my particles are sticking to the surface. But I don't want these to be emitted at a rate. So I'm going to come to the emission tab. I want to change the emission to shot. I'm going to change the shot count to 25,000. Just play with this figure. When you're building your scene, you might need to have a few less particles, but I like to have 25. I think it's a good number, but again, this is all a matter of preference and how fast your system can run. We don't need to change the speed here, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to do 0. These are going to be stuck to the surface of the plane. They're not going to be moving. So if I just play this now, we now have our particles on our plane, and that's looking quite good. By default, these arrows are being displayed on the Z+ axis. I want these to be moving around with the Advection, so I'm going to come into the extended data here, and where it says user rotation, just check that. I want these particles to be moving in the direction of the emission. So I'm going to set this to tangential. And now when I play, these are now all standing up like soldiers. They're now following the path of the emission, which was on the +Y, because we're emitting straight out of the plane here. So we now know that this is working. Okay, so I think we're kind of there now. We're ready to rock and roll. Something I forgot to do a long time ago, and that's to save my project. So I'm just going to save my project. You should actually save your project regularly. It's kind of a bad habit that we've all got into, and we do forget. So yeah, so save your project. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in the Shockwave again, and let's just come back to the beginning here. I'm going to bring in the ExplosiaFX, and if I play this now, nothing's going to happen. And what we need to do now is tell ExplosiaFX to advect the particles. So we come into ExplosiaFX, and there's a tab called Advection. All you need to do is just check this box, and it should work. I'm going to turn off these fields here. I don't need to be doing any extra calculating. I just want the velocity to be transferred to the advected particles. So now when I play, something's happening, but it's not what we wanted. We took all that time to make this lovely shockwave, and nothing's working the way we want it. So I'm going to turn off the flag reference, and let's just see exactly what's going on. See, there you go. They're getting a small bit of action with the ExplosiaFX there, but then the particles just drop out. And the reason for that is that the ExplosiaFX is advecting all the particles in the system, and we only want it to advect the advected particles. So if we come into the Shockwave here and we come to modifiers, we have this field here and we can just drop ExplosiaFX into this field. So once we drop this into the field, you can see this negative icon here. This means that ExplosiaFX is going to ignore the shockwave particles. So now when we play, we have our shockwave back, which is brilliant. So if I turn my flag reference back on and I now play, we now have our particles being affected by our shockwave. This is exactly what we want. I'm going to come into the top view here. I'm going to turn off the flag reference. I'm going to hide it from the viewport by holding Alt and double clicking the traffic lights. I'm going to hide the shockwave from the viewport. I'm going to hide the ExplosiaFX from the viewport as well. So now we just got the affected particles, and I'm going to come into, let's come into our camera. So we're looking straight down there and we're just going to play this. There you go. And see here, this is what I mean about the vorticity. If you play around with that number, if you come into ExplosiaFX here and just come into this simulation and this vorticity, the higher number, the tighter these are going to be, and you can really add some lovely variation to your affected particles here. So let's see if I just change this up to say 60. There you go. So now we've got some like tighter curls going on here. We've got some more vorticity going on. So let's just play this again so we can see. We've got some lots of eddies going on here, which is really great. This is exactly what we want. So I'm just going to bring this back down to, I don't know, say 30. So now when we play this, you still have these eddies going on, but they're not so tight now. So we'll just play around with this figure, play around with the turbulence strength and the turbulence radius, and you get some amazing simulations going on. Well, I've talked about getting some variation by changing parameters in the shockwave emission, and I've talked about getting some variation in the ExplosiaFX simulation tab. But also you can change the complete look just by moving your shockwave emitter. So I'm just going to move that over to the right here, and if we play now, we've now got a completely different look for our simulation. We've got these lovely eddies just moving across and everything's jiggling around, and you've got some beautiful waves going on here. You can even, let's come out of the camera here. Let's just move this one here, and I'm going to copy this one over to the left hand side. And if we start playing this now, you get another completely different look. And so now we've got like two shockwaves working against each other, and they're just like jiggling everything around, and there's some beautiful waves and eddies rolling around there. It's pretty cool. Yeah, so there's a myriad of things to explore with this technique. I'm just gonna just go back, just gonna put these emitters back to where they were for the next stage. But it's up to you. It's up to you what you want to do. I mean, like, change your image for sure. I like big bold colors. I like to have images that kind of like look like vectors. I just feel that you get like some lovely results there. So you can use any image in here. So just experiment, just play around, and it's a good way to relax. And if you've got some sort of creative block going on, just fire up your X particles and just play around. That's what I do. And you can come up with some really interesting looks. So that's that now. So the next stage is I'm going to show you how to prepare your particles for rendering. I'm going to show you how to do that for standard and physical render. And then I'm going to show you for Octane, and then I'm going to show you for Redshift. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to texture your flag in standard and physical. So I'm not going to go through any render settings here. I'm just going to show you how to apply the geometry to your particles and then your material to your geometry, so we got a nice affected Canadian flag. Okay, so I've created the cube here, which is at a ratio of 1 by 15 by 1, and this is going to be the geometry for the particles. Okay, so in standard and physical, we're going to have to use the XP generator. So I'm going to come into the generator tab. I'm going to open an XP generator. And there's a couple of things in here I need to change before I do anything. So the first thing I need to do is add the emitter that we're going to apply the geometry to. So I'm going to drop the affected emitter into the field. And now everything disappears. So before I apply my geometry to my XP generator, I'm going to change the clone type. I don't want duplicates because I have 25,000 particles in my scene, and that's going to be liable to a crash, or it's going to slow me right down. So I'm going to change this to render instances, and this is going to work exactly the same way as the clonal object. And all I need to do now is to take my geometry and make it a child of the XP generator. So nothing's happening yet, so what we need to do is to play it to refresh the scene. So these are really tiny at the moment. So what's happening at the moment is the XP generator is taking the information from the particle size. So if we come into the XP generator here, and then come to the scale, rotation and offset. So where it says scale using, we're using the particle radius. And what we want to use is the source object scale. So now when we play this, we now have our geometry at the correct scale. Doing it this way, you're going to have more control over the size of your particles. So all you need to do is just change the size of the cube. You can change the size of the Y, you can make it fatter on the X and Z, depending on what look you're going for. So you have more control this way. So at the moment, this material is telling our particles what color they're going to be. And now we need to tell the XP generator what color the particles are. And the way to do that is dead simple. So let's create a standard Cinema 4D material. And we're just going to drop this on our XP generator. Now that material is applied there. So let's open this up. So let's change the name to flag color. Now what we want to do is in the color channel, or you could be using the luminance channel, but I'm just going to be using the color channel, and I'm going to come to the texture tab here, and I'm going to use this drop down menu, and I'm going to select MoGraph color shader. And as soon as I apply this color shader, we now have our colors on our particles, and that's looking pretty smart. So this is how you apply geometry and color to your particles in standard and physical. And now I'm going to show you how to apply geometry and color to your particles in Octane. Okay, so I've got my Octane live viewer into the field here next to our display port. And I'm going to turn this on and we've got nothing happening. We just got this blank screen here. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to apply an Octane object tag to our affected particles. And in this tag, we have a tab for particle rendering. If we set the enable field to geometry, we have some action going on here, but we can't really see what's going on here. So I'm going to come out of the camera. So then now you can see that the Octane object tag has applied some spheres to our particles here. And this isn't the look that we're going for. We're going to have to use some actual geometry. So I'm going to use the geometry that we used in the previous example. And this is a cube which is 1 by 15 by 1. So I'm just going to come to the Octane object tag and I'm going to drop this geometry into this field here. And now we have the geometry applied to our particles. So I'm going to come into the cube that I made, which is the particle geometry, and I'm going to change the Y to say 10 centimeters. Let's try 8. I'm going to change the X to 0.3 and I'm going to change the Z to 0.3. So this is different to setting up with an XP generator because we get a result straight away. So our particles are looking pretty cool there, and this actually runs pretty fast in the live viewer here. That's pretty amazing. So now we've got this lovely action here. We want to apply the Canadian flag to our particles. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to create a glossy material. And I'm going to apply that straight onto, not the emitter, I'm going to drop this straight onto the particle geometry. And there we are, our material has been applied there. And now what we're going to do, we're going to have to come to the material here and I'm going to open the node editor. So to get the color from the affected emitter, we're going to use an instance color, and we're just going to drop this into the node editor here. And I'm going to, for some reason I can't get this, oh there we go, I'm going to pipe this straight into the diffuse channel, and I'm going to come into the instance color here. See here, it's looking for a source, and by default is looking for a file, but we're not going to use a file. So if we use the drop down, we can select particle, and now we got its color source here. I'm going to take the affected emitter and I'm just going to drop it into the field, and watch what happens. Bang, and there we have our Canadian flag going on there. So that's how you set up your particles for rendering in Octane. And now I'm going to show you how to set up your particles for rendering in Redshift. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to set up your particles for Redshift render. And I've docked my Redshift render view here. And I'm going to switch this on and nothing's working. That's a surprise. So what we need to do is pretty much the same as the Octane. I'm going to right click and I'm going to drop a Redshift object tag. So with this tag, it's pretty much the same as the Octane tag. We have this field here for particles. So it's disabled. So what I'm going to do is to is to open up this drop down menu, and you can use your point instances, which gives you an interesting look, and you automatically get the Canadian flag displaying on your particles there. You can use your quad instances and get another completely different look. But what I want to use is the custom objects. And I'm going to use the same geometry that I used for previous two examples. And I'm going to drop this into the field here. And automatically we have this wonderful advection going on here. So how are we going to get our color onto this geometry here? Which is even more simple than the Octane method. So I'm going to come up to the Redshift drop down menu, and I'm going to come to materials, and I'm going to create a new material. And the material I want to create is a particle material. And all you need to do is just drop this onto the particle geometry. And now we've got our colors applied to our particle geometry, and it's looking great. I really enjoyed making this tutorial. If you'd like to see more videos like this, then I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please make a comment below, like, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you don't miss a thing. I hope you learned something new today, and if you create something using this technique, then I would love to see it. You can always tag me on Instagram at almostdailyrender. The link is in the description below. Thanks for stopping by, and I'll see you all again soon.